So the government says that inflation is caused by business charging too much and making too much profits. Is that really the case, or is the government trying to pull one over us? And today we're going to find out the real story. We have on the Wealthability Show, we have Ryan Bourne from the Cato Institute. Great privilege and honor to have you, Ryan, representing the Cato Institute and talking about your book, The War on Prices.
Great to be with you, Tom. Really appreciate it.
So if you would, give us a little of your background on why you're talking about this idea of government controlling the narrative the way they are and trying to influence the way people look at inflation.
Well, I'm an economist here at Cato, and I'm also a commentator. I write for the UK's Times newspaper. I have a weekly column there. And when we saw this burst of inflation, burst of inflation that's been very damaging for households. Grocery prices have gone up 25% in just 4 years. Mortgage rates now, as a result of the tightening of monetary policy, have gone up to 7.5% for a new 30-year fixed mortgage. Voters get angry at that. And when voters get angry at that, politicians and to a lesser extent, central bankers have huge incentives to try and deflect blame elsewhere, whether that be to supposedly greedy corporations, whether it be to Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, or special things that were going on through the pandemic. So what I really noticed when this inflation took off is that there was a tendency to try and blame malevolent actors and one-off factors for an inflation that I think, when you look at the overall sweep of evidence, was primarily driven by excessive macroeconomic stimulus here in Washington, D.C., both from the Federal Reserve and the federal government in Congress. And I think as a result of that deflection of blame, we are creating an environment in which very bad policy ideas are being advocated. Whether it be saying that we can deal with inflation by subsidizing green energy through the Inflation Reduction Act, whether it be thinking we can control inflation by clamping down on using antitrust laws to basically ban mergers or whatever. But most perniciously, we've seen a revival across most of the country in various forms of different price controls, and price controls being advocated at the federal level, a federal anti-price gouging statute, and a tax on businesses for the form of pricing through Joe Biden's war on junk fees. So I'm very worried that certain public misconceptions have been been taken and run with by politicians who are pushing narratives that I think could lead to very, very bad policies, maybe the next time inflation hits, but certainly in individual sectors too.
So before we get to the government's narratives and get into those specifics, let's talk about, if we can, just baseline of what causes inflation, what inflation is. So traditionally, the traditional explanation is it's too much money chasing too few goods. Has that somehow changed in the world? Because it would seem like the Biden administration believes it has changed, that now it's just corporations willy-nilly raising prices.
I think that essential definition still does hold. And what we really mean by that is that inflation on the demand side is determined by the amount of money in circulation and how often it's being spent. So really, combine those two things, we're talking about total levels of spending through the economy. And on the supply side, by how much production is being generated in the real economy. So if you have an imbalance of those things, if you have the amount of money being spent dramatically go up relative to the amount of goods and services being produced, you get inflation. And it's certainly true in the short term as well. If you get a big supply shock, if you get a lot less production and the same amount of money being spent, you can get a temporary increase in the price level from that too. So one of the complexities during this whole period really has been there were certainly times during the pandemic and after the invasion of Ukraine by Vladimir Putin, when international gas prices went up, when we did see certain supply shocks that raised the price level through the economy. But, those effects would be very, very transitory. Remember, people used to argue that inflation was transitory, and they can't really explain the kind of broad-based inflation that we've seen. So if you look over the past 4 years as a whole, the consumer prices are roughly around 11% higher than we'd have expected them to be if inflation had been 2% through that whole period. So what has caused that? Well, real GDP, the supply side of the economy, is only a tiny bit below where we'd expect it to be if it had continued on its pre-pandemic trend. The real big difference that we've seen is total spending in the economy. Right now is 9% higher than we would have expected if we'd have continued on the pre-pandemic trend. And that, to me, is indicative of the fact that we've had excessive macroeconomic stimulus, which is a combination of too much money being produced, overseen by the Federal Reserve, and then Congress spending vast amounts through the pandemic and issuing lots of relief, which built up households' wealth balances and has led to higher spending, more money circulating in the economy, chasing goods and services.
So as an entrepreneur, I've had my own theories about how much money is too much money, because of course, I follow these. All of this has come through so-called tax credits, tax incentives, and with the CARES Act, when the pandemic was at its height and the stock market had dropped precipitously, it seemed to me like that money was needed. That was money that was needed to kind of reboot the economy, to get people to start spending, because we did find, for example, we found our sales dropped in 2 weeks. They dropped 80% during the spring of 2020, and that money that came in seemed to free people up and say, oh, there's money here. I'm going to be okay. I can now spend money. And it seemed like that one was necessary. But then we had several after that, right? We had two later in 2020, and then we had this huge $2 trillion one in March of 2021. Where do you think the breaking point was? Was the CARES Act, for example, that was a $5 trillion one? Was that needed? Was that too much by itself?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So certainly in the pandemic, particularly when you had the periods where governments were closing down businesses and banning people from engaging in lots of economic activity, if they'd done nothing in response in terms of relief, there would have been tons of businesses closed, lots of employment relationships lost unnecessarily. So it kind of made sense to try and smooth people's incomes by protecting kind of people's incomes that they were missing as a result of that activity not occurring. I think, though, even in that period, some of the relief, particularly to state and local governments, was vastly in excess of what was necessary to allow them to continue their operations. And certainly by the time you came to early 2021, when Joe Biden became president, I don't think there was really any need for a massive relief package in the form of the American Rescue Plan, which was $1.9 trillion at the time. Right. Now, if we take a step back, though, what was going on at the same time through the pandemic? If you look at the money supply, so the overall broad money in the economy, that had actually gone up by $6 trillion between the start of the pandemic and towards the end of 2021 going into 2022. So there was more money out there to begin with. And then you were adding the relief to that. It was like adding fuel to the fire. So when the economy reopened in 2021, we saw this vast increase in total spending. So spending usually grows each year by about 3.9%. I believe in 2021 and 2022, it averaged growth well in excess of 9%. So this huge increase in spending. So I think you're exactly right that there needed to be a degree of relief to keep that spending on an even keel and to keep it growing consistently. But clearly what we did went way beyond that. And particularly by the time you got to 2021, there was no real economic case for the vast relief bills that were being passed through Congress.
Well, and then let's go on to one that you referenced already, is the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, where and the infrastructure bill. So and then you also had the semiconductor bill. So now you had I think about $3.5 trillion between them that was put into the economy by the governments, either as grants or credits or some other way to get this money into the economy. How could the government even possibly think that would have anything but add fuel to inflation?
Well, I mean, if I wanted to try and defend Joe Biden's theory with the Inflation Reduction Act in particular was this idea that if you made the economy less dependent on oil and gas by subsidizing a whole bunch of renewable and green technologies, that in future, when oil and gas price shocks hit, that wouldn't pass through into the economy in terms of raising costs and raising prices as much as we saw today. Now, clearly that did nothing to reduce to reduce inflation this time around, because it takes time for that capacity to be built. And, you know, it did add kind of fuel to the fire of an inflation that was already raging. But I don't think we should overestimate the impact of federal spending alone on inflation. I think, you know, the bigger story is really what's going on with monetary policy. Because remember, the central bank, the Federal Reserve, is supposed to react to what Congress is doing, right, and try and tighten monetary policy at the right time to offset what Congress is doing to keep inflation at its 2% target. And the simple story is that through the pandemic, the Federal Reserve oversaw a huge growth in the money supply. That, combined with the federal spending, led to a huge increase in total spending through the economy, which led to production going up to its limits and then just pushed prices up across the economy. And it was only really when the Federal Reserve tightened policy, when the money supply kind of stopped growing, that inflation started to come down quite quickly.
Yeah, so let me take you back to 2008, 9, and 10, because I think there's a corollary here, and I think I wonder if the Fed actually reacted in part because of the consequence of 2008, 9, and 10, when they put in money into the economy. We had this quantitative easing for years and years, and it seemed to have no impact on inflation. In your studies, what have you found about why did it? My question has always been, why did it take so long for inflation to go to the point where the Fed had to raise interest rates? In other words, why didn't we have that inflation in 2018? Why didn't we have that inflation in 2017, 18, 19, before the pandemic, when you had years and years of additional money supply, quantitative easing, and very low interest rates, lots of money being put in by banks, by the central bank, as well as by the banking system? What kept inflation low then? Was it just that they just didn't put in enough at the start, that they underestimated the collapse of the money coming out of the economy in 2008, 9, and 10?
Well, I think you certainly had, some the Federal Reserve increasing kind of base money in reaction to the financial crisis, but you had a lot of big offsetting headwinds against that, both in the form of, they changed their operating model, so they're paying interest on reserves, so that was stopping, deterring or disincentivizing banks to be out there lending more money and kind of generating new spending and new activity at the same time. And of course, we had a lot of after the horse had bolted regulation as well on the financial sector, which of course deterred a lot of financial activity and lending. So if you look at kind of the broad money supply, taking into consideration deposit accounts and other things that you could consider money, it didn't actually grow that quickly coming out of the financial crisis. So nowhere near the amount that we kind of saw this time. So I think that's the kind of key explanation for what we've seen. And there were good reasons why we should have expected real interest rates to be quite low at the time. There's population aging. There was a lot of saving internationally. So there were reasons why interest rates were kept low for so long. But clearly going into this crisis and the reaction to this crisis, policy vastly exceeded what was necessary to keep the economy on an even keel. So that's my kind of big picture explanation for why inflation was much higher this time. That makes sense.
So another question I have, so I get to be the student here, so I'm going to ask you the questions if that's okay. So can you describe what's the difference from an inflationary impact on investment versus consumer spending? So one of the things that we saw.
Sorry, Tom, you broke up there, so I didn't actually hear the back end of the question.
What's the difference, if any, or impact on inflation between consumer spending and investment in the economy? So, for example, you have. Take the infrastructure bill, which is very much an investment, or the semiconductor bill, which is an investment, as opposed to the the 1.9 trillion that you mentioned in May, the American Rescue Plan, which was all consumer spending. Does the consumer spending have a different impact than the investment spending?
In the long run, yes. In the short run, they have quite similar impacts because obviously they're, competing for real resources, and so it doesn't really matter if you're kind of bidding up the wages and input costs of a contractor to build something. That is going to add in the very short run to inflationary pressure. But the difference between investment and consumption in the longer run is obviously that investment tends to generate more production. So if you think about inflation being the balance between the amount of money being spent in circulation against the growth in production, investment tends to generate more production. So that has a kind of disinflationary impact over the long run. And we see this in studies of the impacts of certain taxes as well. So if you cut like basic rates of income tax, the lowest rates of income tax, and the same as if you give people money and they kind of spend it, that tends to be far more inflationary by adding to demand pressure in the economy than, say, a corporate tax rate cut, which can influence investment, and over a kind of 4 or 5 year period actually is disinflationary in some ways, because that investment generates new capacity in the economy to produce goods and services.
Brian, let's talk about how the government is framing this, because the government is framing this as they're very much framing it as putting it on business. There, you mentioned going after mergers. They actually Chuck Schumer recently said that the oil and gas executives should be criminally prosecuted because of their giant profits. And of course, we had this back in the 80s. In the early 80s, we, of course, had the windfall profits tax, which was a direct result of inflation, frankly, and the high prices caused by inflation. So couple of questions. First is your take on this, but second of all, how does business combat this misinformation, prejudice against business?
Yeah, that's two great questions. I mean, the greedflation theory doesn't really make any sense to me. And the basic idea is that with the cost increases from the pandemic in the Ukraine war, consumers came to expect higher prices. And so businesses took advantage of this by raising prices even higher than necessary to given their increased cost base, and led to more profits and inflation at the same time. Now, that doesn't make really any sense for two big picture reasons. One is that it doesn't take competition seriously. We know from basic economics that having firms across numerous sectors in the economy colluding at the same time, there are huge incentives for other businesses to kind of undercut them and try and steal market share. And if firms were colluding, we'd have expected to see them holding back production to raise prices, using their market power to do that. But during this period, 2021 and 2022, when inflation took up, real output was actually incredibly strong. So there's not even any basic evidence that collusive behavior that was holding back output was taking place. But more importantly, it doesn't take consumers seriously. It doesn't ask, why were consumers able to pay these higher prices? And the only way, if one business raises its price, let's suppose, they have a business with huge market power raises its price, and let's suppose that its customers, like in oil and gas, for example, are quite insensitive to the price. They need the product, so they carry on buying it. Well, what happens to their money balances? If they're spending more on that good or service, they have less left over to spend on other goods and services. That diminishes demand in other industries and pushes down other prices. So the only way you get an inflation across the broad economy, as we saw, is if consumers have the willingness and ability to spend more than they did before. And the reason for that is that there was excess stimulus. So my story for why we saw temporary profit spikes in 2021 and 2022 at the same time as inflation is not because businesses were trying to rip consumers off. It was the fact that we had inflationary excess macroeconomic stimulus. Now, why does that generate inflation and higher profits at the same time? Well, if you're bidding up, if you have more money out there chasing goods and services, retail prices tend to be much more flexible. Businesses can change them more quickly than wages or input costs tend to, because wages and input costs for most businesses are determined by contracts that are only negotiated once a year or whatever. And wages in particular, we know, tend to be much more sticky. So yes, we did see periods in which profits and prices were going up at the same time, but that was a consequence of there being too much total spending in the economy. It wasn't, businesses just suddenly deciding to become more greedy or having more market power. So I just don't think this narrative makes any sense. Now, how can businesses combat that? Well, it's incredibly difficult, particularly in an election year, because you're putting your head above the parapet and you risk presidents kind of going after you or potentially punishing you, having the FTC set on you. So businesses are really in a kind of no-win situation. I think what some of the big retailers are doing now in terms of talking about how they're price competitive relative to their rivals is about the best thing that you can do to try and kind of overcome this pressure. But in this febrile political environment, when 90% of Americans now, because of what's been going on in politics, say that businesses are at least partly to blame for inflation, it's an incredibly difficult environment for businesses and entrepreneurs.
So do you think that, do you think government truly believes that they are better at the economy than the free market?
Well, I think there's certainly a lot of people here in Washington, D.C. who do think that. They kind of see what they describe as market failures everywhere. And they think by just pulling some lever or controlling some price or introducing some subsidy, they can get us to a better allocation of resources than free markets alone would determine. Now, when it comes to price controls, which is the big topic in my book, we know that historically that has not been the case. We have lots of studies, case studies, empirical lessons through history of the impact on price caps, where you hold prices below market prices, market determined prices. And those consequences are obvious. They tend to lead to shortages. They tend to lead to deteriorations in the quality of goods and services provided, and they tend to lead to extensive black markets. But for whatever reason, whenever there's major price volatility in the economy, you always get a number of politicians advocating for these types of interventions, despite the long record of failure that they've had. And, that's profoundly depressing, but I think it's indicative of why we need sensible macroeconomic policy and why we need restrained monetary policy, because when you do get unexpected inflations, which redistribute income and wealth quite arbitrarily, the general public tends to get very upset that some people are perceived to be benefiting from their pain. And that leads to pressure on politicians to push for these very bad ideas. So we should try and first do no harm by not engaging in this expansive, over excessive monetary policy in the first place, because it generates all these damaging downstream consequences.
Let's turn to my favorite subject, taxes, because we are going to see, we know, major tax changes next year, 2025, or at the latest 2026, because of the way the 2017 Tax Act was written to expire largely next year. We have one party that effectively wants to continue those policies with the Republican Party, which is about a $2 trillion tax decrease over what would happen if they just expire. And can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
And we have on the other side, we have a sitting president that is running on the idea of a $5 trillion tax increase. So how do you see taxes playing into the whole economy and inflation and the impact on the market?
Yeah, that's a great question. If the Federal Reserve is doing its job properly, the tax policy shouldn't have too much impact on inflation. We saw after 2017 there were obviously big tax reductions, but that didn't lead to an inflationary environment. Indeed, inflation was below target. So, provided the Federal Reserve is adjusting to tax and spending policy, it shouldn't lead to too much inflation. But then there's a bigger question of what is effective policy for kind of growth and opportunity and jobs and everything else. And I had my quibbles about the 2017 tax law, but I think it had some pretty worthy corporate income tax reforms. I think some of the stuff it did around expensing of business investment was a positive, and actually in the longer run would lead to higher levels of investment, which would actually be disinflationary, if anything. Now, Joe Biden kind of talks a big game about wanting to repeal the tax cuts, but from the data that I've seen, the fact that he wants to not raise, he says he doesn't want to raise people's taxes below $400,000 on, at least on the income side, that would be the vast cost of renewing the tax cuts to begin with. And it's also a little dishonest because we know from the economic literature that the impact of raising the corporate tax rate is in part borne by workers, because if you raise the corporate tax rate, you diminish investment. That leads to lower productivity growth, and as a result of that, wages don't go up as quickly. So at least part of the corporate tax side is borne by workers. So even though Joe Biden says this promise to not raise taxes on anybody earning less than $400,000, actually raising the corporate income tax would raise their taxes by imposing a burden on them. Now, we clearly have a bigger problem going forward in that we've got all these contingent liabilities in the form of Social Security and Medicare promises to an increasingly aging population. And we have a long-term debt time bomb as a result of that requires fiscal consolidation. It requires deficit reduction. I think that has to be part of the conversation. And as a result of that, it may be to try and diminish the growth of spending. Republicans at some stage are going to have to accept that some taxes will go up at the same time. But I think if we were just to repeal the TCJA entirely, that would be a very, very damaging tax increase, particularly on the business side.
Interesting. Final words on your thoughts on government attempts to control the economy versus a free economy, and how to, again, I'm going to reiterate, how do businesses handle that? Because there's clearly an attack, not just on the big business, but there's clearly an attack on small business going on right now.
Yeah, there is. And unfortunately, some of these ways of looking at the world have kind of seeped into Republican politics as well, where you've got a group within that cohort called the National Conservatives who, want much more government control of the economy in terms of allocating capital and resources through industrial policy, want new protectionism in terms of trade policy, and want new government programs to push workers into particular fields, usually like heavy manufacturing. And unfortunately, the lessons of history is this comes with a big efficiency cost. And what do we mean by that? Well, it means basically lower productivity and lower wages ultimately for Americans, higher cost of importing basic goods and services, which squeezes people's living standards. So I really regret the path that we're kind of going down with the Democrats, who want extensive industrial interventions for green industries on the one hand, and Republicans going the other way and wanted extensive industrial interventions for manufacturing industries. But I think there's a bigger point here, which is that even aside from the basic economic impacts, this sort of policy agenda tends to lend itself to political corruption as well. And what do I mean by that? Well, if businesses, rather than focusing on serving their consumers best according to what they believe consumers want, start second guessing what the president of the day wants in terms of their output, whatever, then that diverts resources into things that are very, very unproductive. And we've kind of seen this already as part of the CHIPS Act, for example. Some of the conditions for receiving subsidies through those programs requires businesses to set up childcare arrangements, for example, or engage in DEI audits and ensure that they have a diverse workforce and things like that. So the question then becomes, well, I thought these subsidies were supposed to encourage chip production, or are they supposed to be a kind of social policy through the back door? And unfortunately, when you get these extensive industrial interventions, as we're seeing, not only do they divert resources to things that are unproductive in an economic sense, but they take businesses away from their key objectives, which should be generating profit in service of consumers for their actual product, and gets them involved in all sorts of social policy, which really should not be their agenda.
No, that's a good point. Of course, the Inflation Reduction Act does the same by requiring basically union labor and union labor prices, apprenticeships, et cetera. I mean, there are a lot of things like that. I think that's a really good point, Ryan. Appreciate you bringing that up. So the book is The War on Prices: How Popular Misconceptions About Inflation, Prices, and Value Create Bad Policy. Very important book for our times. Thank you very much, Ryan, for authoring this book, and thanks for being on the show. And where can we find more about you and the Cato Institute?
You can go to cato.org, and I have my individual kind of author profile there. I also write a Substack called The War on Prices, which is the title of this book. And you can buy this book Amazon, Barnes & Noble, a range of different bookstores online. That
when we do get more information, better educated on macroeconomic policy, it also affects our microeconomic situation as business owners and investors, and we end up making way more money and paying way less tax. We'll see y'all next time.
This podcast is a presentation of Rich Dad Media Network.